Brazil, Russia, India, China, and then South Africa. The Brics. What do these countries all have in common? A newfound economic alliance, with the long-term goal of taking down the US dollar. The alliance ties together 5 countries which occupy 27% of the world's land surface and 42% of the world's population. Despite their size, they were always viewed as economically weak in comparison to the Western powers of the United States and Europe. But since their formation in 2009, these countries, with the exception of Russia, have seen high rates of economic growth, which has allowed their GDP to grow to $27.6 trillion. In the 13 years since their formation, these allied nations have closed the gap toward the traditional economic superpowers of the West. And in 2022, the BRIC nations took a further step by overtaking the long-established G7 countries in terms of total economic share. This year, it was announced that more members were being added: Argentina, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, the United Arab Emirates, and the trillion-dollar economy of Saudi Arabia. We did a video about their economic plan for the future, which you can check out here. In one swoop, the BRICS have more than doubled their share of oil production to 43% of total world output, while taking their share of global GDP to 36%. Despite being geographically disconnected, the economic might of these countries continues to grow, and forecasts estimate that the original members will have a combined GDP of 38 trillion in just 5 years. Following the latest summit, Vladimir Putin was quoted as saying that the BRICS global influence will continue to grow, and President Xi stated that the BRICS is an important force in shaping the international landscape. So can these geographically disjointed countries bond together to form a currency union to match that of the euro and even the dollar? For a long time, the US and EU have been viewed as the gold standard for global economies, and together they occupy just under 30% of global GDP after adjusting for purchasing power parity. As the power of the BRICS continues to grow, they have become increasingly outspoken about the US and European Union, particularly the United States and the dollar. The president of Brazil, Lula da Silva, has been quoted as saying, "Every night I ask myself why all countries have to base their trade on the dollar," adding, "Who was it that decided that the dollar was the currency after the disappearance of the gold standard?" Let's quickly answer that question. The dollar became the global currency after the Bretton Woods Agreement back in 1944. After World War II, many previously large economies had been wrecked, and the US was the only real economic superpower globally, being the largest economy and also having the most gold reserves, something which currencies were linked to at the time. The dollar was pegged to the price of gold, and from this many countries pegged their currency to the dollar. By doing this, it would allow countries with weaker economies, such as some in an emerging Europe, to avoid fluctuations in their currency's value, which can cause economic crises. It was a system which greatly benefited the USA. In modern times, the dollar is no longer pegged to gold, and many nations no longer peg their currency to the dollar. Nevertheless, the dollar has remained as the global currency of choice. As many countries can't use their own currency to make purchases or service debt, it makes sense to do this in dollars as it's widely accepted. For this reason, many nations still have large dollar stores. In fact, the US dollar still dominates global reserves, accounting for 61.82% of foreign exchange reserves worldwide. The euro is second with 20.24%, but the dollar still accounts for more than all the other currencies combined. Ironically, China has the largest reserve of dollars, holding $3.2 trillion. Being the global currency of courses gives the US a number of advantages. As the dollar is in such demand worldwide, it has meant that the US has been able to issue lots of government bonds while offering a relatively low rate of interest. This low debt servicing cost is part of the reason why the USA has been able to sustain and even increase substantial external debt without facing dire economic consequences. This has also allowed the US to finance their economic growth of the last century by printing money. Typically, when a nation increases its money supply, it leads to inflation, which diminishes the purchasing power of its citizens, placing particular burden on the lower and middle classes, whilst also being incredibly politically unpopular. Much of the US's spending abroad is also done in dollars. Not only does this help to curb inflation, it also helps increase other nations' dependency on the currency, future-proofing it. Much of global trade is also done in dollars. Say that, Ecuador and Sweden want to trade, it's unlikely that either will hold large amounts of each other's currency. So instead, it makes sense to conduct the transaction in dollars, as this is something which both countries can use and don't need to deal with multiple currency exchanges. Being the global currency not only means that the US dollar's value on the currency market stays relatively stable, it also gives the US a tremendous amount of power without the use of military force through the use of sanctions, because they are handled by so-called correspondent banks with accounts at the Federal Reserve. By cutting off the ability to transact in dollars, the United States can make it difficult for those it blacklists to do business. For example, in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, unprecedented US sanctions cut Russia off from the dollar, freezing $300 billion in Russian central bank assets and triggering a default on the country's sovereign debt. Whilst the dollar is still powerful, this is changing. The central bank's dollar reserves are at a 20-year low of 58%. And the head of market research at JP Morgan has said that the power of the dollar has declined significantly between 2014 and 2022. This is obviously a thorn in the side of BRIC countries like Russia, who feel this power directly, or ones like China, who sees it as slowing down their growth. When countries need more money, they usually have two options. They increase their own money supply through printing more money, or they can borrow it. Traditionally, this would be through the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. They could offer a loan for a few $billion, and the country borrowing would agree on an interest rate. However, the terms for such a loan are once again controlled by the Western powers. And when we look at the voting rights for this, we can see the US and European countries dominate this, meaning they get to dictate the terms of loans and also the interest rates. Controlling who gets money and under what terms is significantly powerful. So what can these BRIC countries do to take the power away from the United States and its dollar? Create a new BRIC currency with the long-term potential of the dollar. The idea of a central currency between these nations is not new. It was first discussed when the nations aligned in 2009. The BRICS have created something called the NDB, or New Development Bank. This would be their equivalent to rival the IMF, and also the vehicle for which their currency could be created. By creating a new currency, BRICS countries can reduce their use of dollars, which would have a long-term effect of weakening the United States. The most commonly proposed method of doing this is by linking it to gold and other metals with intrinsic value. Like the method we saw was used in the past, the idea remains the same. Gold would be held in the NDB, where the currency can be exchanged for a fixed amount of gold. As the value of gold is relatively stable over time, it avoids large fluctuations in the price of the currency. A common currency has potential, as each of the current BRIC members is an economic heavyweight in their given geographical regions. As put by foreignpolicy.com, if Thailand felt compelled to use the currency to do business with China, Brazil's importers could still purchase shrimp from Thai exporters, keeping Thailand's shrimp on Brazil's menus. Trade restrictions can also be circumvented by exporting to one country then to another, which would have been the original destination. Whilst this is more complicated, it is already something which is used to bypass sanctions. However, the common currency does also have its complications. If it's used primarily for international trade rather than domestic circulation, it would complicate the role of the nation's central banks. But as we have seen with the euro, this is of course not impossible. The BRICS also are competing with one another and have different economic objectives, making it harder to coordinate and determine monetary policy between them on the use of a single currency. The largest currency union in existence is of course the euro. Whilst the nations are run by leaders with different views, they are largely in agreement about large issues, such as the war in Ukraine. The same could not be said about the BRIC Union, each of which has leaders with their own conflicting worldview and policies. Despite being made up of some of the richest countries in the world, the euro has also had its problems, as member states can put the value of the whole currency at risk, like in 2009 with the Eurozone crisis, where several Eurozone member states were unable to repay or refinance their government debt. This is another potential hindrance of the common BRIC currency, especially as Russia's economy looks to be in decline due to its military activity in Ukraine and various sanctions. And with more countries being added, potentially weakening the individual links in the BRIC chain. What is, however, harder is the complicated state of geopolitics between the member states. Whilst their leaders can meet at a summit and be civil, many of the nations have misaligned interests. No two more than China and India. They are the largest economies of the BRIC nations, but also the two with the most disagreements. They share a 2,167-mile border, much of which is disputed. This has meant the two countries have been engaged in armed conflict with each other for over 50 years. This boiled over in an incident on the 5th May 2020, where both sides took shots at each other, resulting in the death of 20 Indian and 5 Chinese soldiers. This is believed to be caused by the construction of an Indian road to a high-altitude airbase. The troops also clashed again in December 2022. This demonstrates the difficulties that will likely occur if these nations all enter into a common currency and cast doubt on its creation. The Brics are rapidly growing, and the list of nations who have applied to be part is getting longer. A common BRIC currency wouldn't necessarily dethrone the dollar. Many countries would and will continue to keep using it for trade and as a store of value. However, what it would mark is the continuation of the ever-increasing trend, which sees power taken bit by bit away from the United States.